to everyone for tuning in today. I'm sure you'll find this an exciting and provocative hour. Today, we are privileged to host someone who does not take the easy way or the well-trodden path. Someone who lives his life as a journalist, exclusively covering Israeli-Palestinian events to pursue truth and expose hypocrisy and corruption, and thereby risk his own personal safety. At Honest Reporting, we recognize that words are a weapon, sometimes more deadly than physical force or coercion. In the next hour, we'll come to appreciate the bravery and integrity of our guest. Khaled Abu Toameh has worked as a television presenter, has worked as a producer, documentarian, worked for NBC, is a long-standing journalist at the Jerusalem Post since 2002, and has written for too many publications to mention here, and has spoken internationally, including the UK House of Parliament, House of Commons. He is currently the Shillman Journalism Fellow at the prestigious Gatestone Institute. In this session, we will cover a very broad range. There's a lot to talk about, including the violence as of last night that Khaled can watch outside his window over his balcony, and he'll tell us about that. So first, to get started though, I'd like to ask Khaled, and to those who have read our flyer, you have in a recent interview described yourself as a Muslim, an Arab, a Palestinian, and a citizen of Israel. Can you tell us briefly what that means to you?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to all the Honest Reporting fans and supporters. You know, we have a crisis of identity over here. And many times when people ask me, you know, how do you describe yourself? I say, well, first of all, I'm an Arab. I'm a citizen of Israel. My faith is Muslim. And if you want, you can also call me Palestinian. So we end up saying, you know, Israeli, Arab, Muslim, Palestinian, doesn't really matter. But I normally like to or prefer to choose Arab citizen of Israel. Not because, you know, I have anything against the Palestinians. My mother is originally a Palestinian from the West Bank, but I don't want people to confuse me with Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. So I say an Arab citizen of Israel or an Arab Israeli citizen, which is fine with me. I have no problem being a citizen of Israel. I'm actually proud to be a citizen of Israel, to belong to the Arab minority inside Israel. And, you know, this is how I describe myself.
Tell us, Khaled, how did you come in briefly into not just to journalism, but into this aspect of journalism where you're really fighting? It's not the easiest role you've chosen for yourself. So how did this come about?
Well, first of all, you know, I always say journalism has to be in your blood. It's something that comes with you in birth. And what do I mean? You have to be the curious type, the type of person who always wants to learn things, to look around and see why things are happening, to try to find an explanation to them. And I remember myself, even at the age of 6, 7, I was always arguing or fighting with my brothers and sisters. They wanted to watch Tom and Jerry on TV. I always wanted to watch the news. And that's where it really starts. You know, curiosity, the desire to learn. When I finished high school, I started my career as a journalism even before going to Hebrew University. I found, first of all, work in a Palestinian newspaper in East Jerusalem, then at Israel Television, then with the international media, writing also for the Israeli media. And that's how I launched my career from the age of 17 and a half or 18. Now, you know, I see journalism as being some kind of a mission. Now, it's not about being pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. It's about telling the truth, telling the facts as they are, and being able to bring a balanced picture or portray a balanced picture to your readers. I don't think there's anything unusual about reporting about corruption, for example, in the Palestinian Authority. Why is that considered a taboo? Why is it that when an Arab writes about Arab corruption, he becomes a Zionist agent, while if a Jew writes about the corruption of the Israeli government, he's praised as a liberal, as progressive, and things like that? Now, I can understand where it comes from, because I come from a culture where the Arab culture, the Muslim culture, the Palestinian culture, if you want, where criticism of the government and the president and the prime minister or of your people is considered an act of treason. In our culture, a journalist is supposed to be loyal to his president, his prime minister, his government, his homeland, his people. And, the truth, it doesn't really matter right now. And I'm often criticized by some Palestinians and others for simply reporting the truth, the facts. I go to Ramallah almost every day, and the only criticism I get when I go there is, okay, Khaled, what you reported is accurate, it's true, but you shouldn't have reported it. Please shut up. So that's where it really comes from.
Let me ask you this, Khaled. Let's expand. So we're right in the heart of what we do, which is media bias and honest reporting. And I want to expand this. And it's fascinating what you say about the point of view of the Palestinians towards this loyalty you should have. But what about the Western media? I'd like to read you something you wrote. Many Western journalists do not feel the need to conceal their hatred for Israel and the Jews. But when it comes to the Palestinians, these journalists see no evil. So you explain the Palestinian journalists, but what about the rest of the journalists?
Are you talking about the Western journalists?
Yes.
Look, I've worked over the past 40 years with hundreds of international reporters and journalists and very prominent correspondents from all around the world. One of my jobs has been to help international reporters who come here cover the Palestinian issue. And I can talk from, firsthand experience. What I'm writing and saying is not based on what I heard. It's based on my own experience with the international media. Now, there is a problem. There's a very serious problem when it comes to covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what do I mean by that? I would say something like this. If I were to sum up my experiences with the international media, I would say that most of them, the majority, they look at this conflict as if it's a conflict between good guys and bad guys. The good guys are the poor Palestinians, and the bad guys are Israel. And that's where it really starts. Some of them come to this part of the world already with this perception. And it's like, Khaled, please don't confuse us with the facts. Now, what happens is that many of these journalists, they wake up in the morning and they search for any story that reflects negatively on Israel. And it doesn't matter what happens in Gaza and the West Bank. That's not a story. It's like, oh, give me an anti-Israel story and maybe my editors will be happy and my readers will love me and maybe my publisher will reward me, and then afterwards I can go to the university campuses and be described as a hero and a liberal and a progressive guy, and I can later even go to the bar at the American Colony Hotel and hang out there, or go to a fancy restaurant in Ramallah. So, I mean, that's part of it. Now, I'm not saying that all the media is like that. But what I'm saying is that this obsession with Israel on the part of many journalists has caused Israel huge damage. It's actually delegitimizing Israel and even demonizing Jews. And now, I'm not saying Israel should not be criticized, but excuse me, isn't there any wrongdoing on the Palestinian side? Why is it that many of these journalists turn a blind eye to corruption in the Palestinian Authority, to lack of freedom of speech under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and under Hamas in Gaza? These are questions that we need to ask. You know, after the Oslo Accords, had the international media back then paid enough attention to what Palestinians were saying about corruption, about the fact that the Palestinian Authority was depriving its own people of the international aid, had the international media paid enough attention back then to these complaints, we would have been in a much better situation. Why? Because if newspapers in Canada and in Europe and in the US report about what's happening to US, Canadian, European taxpayer money, it's possible that the public would have gone to the leaders in your countries, banged on the table and said, excuse me, why are we funding corrupt regimes? Why is our money being stolen? But no one wanted to pay attention. Only a few journalists did, by the way. Yasser Arafat got away with the corruption. He deprived his people of the international aid. That played into the hands of Hamas. And look where we are now. It's a total mess. So I do have a problem with the international media's take on this conflict. And I'm sorry to tell you, it hasn't changed. It's because of this reporting. It is because of this reporting that we see an increase in anti-Semitism, that we see all these people at the university campuses waging all these anti-Israel campaigns. And it's time for the international media to also start paying attention to what is happening on the other side. Some of the foreign reporters tell me, oh, we're scared. We can't report because we need to go back to Ramallah. We need to go back to Gaza. It's dangerous. And I tell them, excuse me, if anyone should be afraid, it's me, the local Arab journalist who's living here. You guys have, embassies, you have consulates, you have your own governments that will protect you. And secondly, why are you going to cover a conflict if you're going to allow yourself to be intimidated by one party? You will never be able to do your job. So you need to quit journalism and go find yourself another job. Can you imagine if Israel was threatening them? Ironically, some of these journalists sometimes tell me, oh, we can't report anything that reflects negatively on the PLO, Hamas, because it's not like Israel, it's not democracy. And I'm like, what? So there is a problem. There is a problem. And, we can write books about it, this problem.
You've exposed that hypocrisy, and it's interesting. I was going to ask you, but I think you've answered the question. Has, over a period of time, and you've been doing this for quite a while, have things gotten better? And I think you've just said things have stayed the same, which is discouraging. Do you think things have gotten worse in a way?
I actually think it's gotten worse. Why? Because there's this new generation of reporters who are, first of all, foreign reporters, who are, first of all, influenced by social media. And we all see what's happening on social media with regards to Israel. Some of these foreign journalists, by the way, they rely on social media more than they rely on real journalism, more than they rely on professional ethics, which means doing your job. You can't just take stuff out of social media and report it as if, you are an expert and you've been there and you've talked to people. That it doesn't work like that.
So you've called these in the past parachute journalists. Do you want to talk about what you mean by that?
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly what I mean. Look, I've met many journalists who came to this part of the world with no knowledge about the Middle East. You can't get on a plane, read the Time magazine or the New York Times and land here for the first time in your life and start reporting as if you are an expert. I've met journalists who don't know what Hamas is. I've met journalists who have asked me to, recently, by the way, only 3 or 4 years ago, I've met journalists, foreign journalists, who have asked me to take them to interview Jewish settlers living in Gaza. And other journalists, I've met other journalists who have asked me to take them to see the mass graves in Jenin, where Jews massacred thousands of Palestinians in 2002. And, you know, endless. And it's like, excuse me, folks, I mean, do your homework. You can't send someone who is covering the sports in France to do stories over here. It doesn't work like that. There is a lot of ignorance also, and these are what we call the parachute journalists you are talking about. Many of them, you know, I'm sorry to tell you, but they've become like a joke. And they are harming our profession. Sometimes I'm even ashamed to say that I'm a journalist when I see how some of these journalists are reporting.
Let me ask you this. At a high level, there's a bias and there's hypocrisy. When there's misreporting at Honest Reporting, it's pretty easy to see the misreporting, and it's pretty easy to write and try and do something about it. The hardest challenge for us is when there's dishonesty by lack of reporting or omission or failure to cover some things. And in today's world, where we're particularly sensitized, certainly on this side of the ocean, to human rights and extremely paying attention to human rights issues, you've written this about human rights. The international community pays attention to the Palestinians only when they are victims of Israel. The continued obsession of the media on Israel allows the Arab countries, as well as the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, to proceed with their systematic violations of human rights and freedoms of speech. Why does this get overlooked?
Look, let me tell you something like this. One of my jobs here is to tip off international journalists about stories. Okay, you know, they ask me, oh, please let us know when you have a good story. Let's say tomorrow morning, I call my colleagues and I tell them, I have a good story for you. They will ask me, what's the story? I will say, 6 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. They will say, oh my God, that's a great story. We need to get there quickly. Can you please help us? And then, you know, on the way, they will say, wait, who killed them? Hamas. Then, you know, the whole situation changes, and it's like, oh, Khaled, you know, I have to take my wife to the dentist. The other guy has to drive his daughter to school. The third guy has an appointment with his friend, and so there's no story. Why? Because, you know, Israel is not involved. Now, if I call the same group of journalists and I tell them, listen, I have a good story for you. They will ask me, what's the story? I will say, well, today a Jewish soldier slapped a Palestinian on the face. They will say, what? Where did that happen? Let's hire a helicopter and fly to that place because that is breaking news. Now, this is basically what's happening. I've covered, or I've been at demonstrations in Ramallah where Palestinian police used excessive force to disperse Palestinians, you know, protesting against corruption, against crack down on free speech and things like that. I didn't see many journalists over there, many foreign journalists. And I didn't see foreign journalists even report about these demonstrations. In the last few days, I've been going to Damascus Gate, which is not very far from here, the old city of Jerusalem, to watch the confrontations between the Israel police and Palestinian youths over there. And I can tell you, I really believe there were more foreign journalists over there than Palestinian protesters. And each policeman was surrounded by like 2 or 3 foreign journalists and foreign cameramen and photographers, and this is what we are talking about, and this is what happens now. Look, if you want to look at the positive side of it, Israel's a democracy, and these journalists feel free. I saw when a journalist walks up to an Israeli soldier or an Israeli policeman and puts the camera in his face and all that, the Israeli policeman, cannot do anything about it. And the foreign journalist feels confident. Why? Because Israel is a country of law and order. He knows that if this policeman, may God forbid, attacks him, he will be disciplined. There will be consequences. He'll be held responsible. But that doesn't happen in Ramallah. It doesn't happen in Gaza, of course. How many foreign journalists are there in Gaza? How many? There's another problem we haven't talked about, which is the reliance of the foreign media on Palestinian stringers. Mm-hmm. And stringers means assistants, helpers, and people who provide them with the information. Now, if some of these stringers and producers or assistants are affiliated with the PLO and Hamas, that means they set the agenda. They tell you what the story is, and you are totally in their hands. You are not independent anymore. And you cannot report anything that angers them because they will stop working with you. So that's another issue that needs to be taken into consideration.
Let me ask you about a lot of the conversation around peace in the Middle East revolves around the refugees and the refugee status. And again, I'm going to quote yourself on this topic because it's as articulate as I've seen. And you write about how Palestinian leaders treat their refugees. And what you said this recently, Palestinian officials would rather see their people continue living in devastating poverty as refugees than improve their living conditions. They want millions of Palestinians to remain stuck in refugee camps so that the Palestinian leadership can continue milking the world for money. Now, that's strong words. Tell us about that.
Well, I see that you've been reading Gatestone, which is not a bad idea, but yes, why not? Why are we not allowed to use harsh words? What's wrong with criticizing Palestinian leadership? The article you were referring to was about Palestinian refugees demonstrating in front of the Palestinian embassy in Lebanon to demand that the Palestinian leadership help them. These are refugees who ran away from the civil war in Syria. They ran away to Lebanon, and they went to the Palestinian embassy. They approached the Palestinian leadership asking for help. And what kind of help did the Palestinian Authority provide them? It sent thugs and security officers to beat the refugees. And the reason I wrote about this was because it really reflects the long-standing policy of Palestinian leadership towards the issue of refugees. The Palestinian leadership, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority later, Hamas and all these factions, what have they done for the issue of the refugees? They want the issue of the refugees to remain the United Nations problem, to remain the international community's problem, They want these refugees to stay where they are. They do not want them to move on with their lives. They are even depriving other people of helping them and keeping them in refugee camps. Why are there why are there still 3 refugee camps located only a few miles away from President Abbas's residence and office? Why should there be refugee camps in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority control? What has the Palestinian Authority done for them? Of course, they want these refugees to stay where they are in order to keep the issue of the refugees alive as a way of, blaming Israel and holding Israel responsible for the plight of the Palestinians, while Palestinian leadership is not doing anything to help them.
You could say the same thing about Jordan, couldn't you? That the treatment of the Palestinians in Jordan is no better than the treatment you just described from the Lebanese government.
Well, ironically, in Jordan, it's still a bit better. It's relatively good because in Jordan, Palestinians still, Jordan's like one of the few countries that still gives Palestinians temporary citizenship, passports, which is not bad. I mean, the other Arab countries don't care at all. They don't give them, the Arab world treats the Palestinians as second class, third class, and fourth class, and fifth class citizens. Do you know how many calls I get from Palestinians living in Arab countries asking me if I know someone inside Israel who they can bribe to get an Israeli passport and move to Israel? In Lebanon, there's a law that bans Palestinians from working in 52 professions. It used to be 70 professions. A Palestinian in Lebanon cannot be a carpenter, a cab driver. In Egypt and other Arab countries, Palestinians are deprived of the right to ownership of land, of property, and other property. And there are endless examples. This is the real apartheid, by the way, which no one talks about. And at Gatestone, we regularly expose this, and we don't get answers, but it's an eye-opening. People call me and say, "Wow."
Just to remind people, we have a map I'd like to put on a screen of Israel and the Middle East as to what we're talking about in terms of land and the amount of attention Israel gets. So on this map, you can see in the light color that I would call the Arab world, essentially the Arab countries, and then there's a little tiny piece off the med there called Israel. So you see it as a land area. And I think the point is that the Arab world is not coming to the aid of the Palestinians themselves. We can take that down. It's not coming to the aid of the Palestinians themselves. But so the interesting question to me, and you'll have a point of view on this, is that you have this corruption at the top. It's visible. I'm sure what you're saying is known to the Palestinian person himself on either side of the green line, wherever they're located, this corruption, this subjugation. There was no Arab uprising, so to speak, against the governing authorities, be it Hamas or Fatah, 10 years ago when that Arab Spring took place. It kind of fizzed out, we know. But what level of discontent is there, if any, by the young against this kind of oppression? And we'll get to late elections in a few moments, so I don't want to get into that right now. But why is there just an acceptance of this kind of suppression?
Look, at the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, we did have a Palestinian Spring. We did have Palestinians in Gaza who protested against Hamas, and we had Palestinians in Ramallah who protested against the Palestinian Authority. In Gaza, they set up tents in downtown Gaza, in the center of Gaza City, with all these youth and chanting, slogans against Hamas. We want regime change. They were trying to copy what was happening in Egypt. And in Ramallah, the same thing happened. But this Palestinian Spring was short-lived. It was quickly suppressed by Hamas and by the Palestinian Authority. They sent policemen and thugs to burn the tents, to beat up the activists, and that was the end of the so-called Palestinian Spring. Now, does that mean that Palestinians are not aware of the corruption and of all these repressive measures by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas? Yes, they are. Does that mean that there are no Palestinians who are speaking out? Yes, they are. But where are they? Most of them do it secretly. Some of them are living abroad, or some of them have to move into Israel to be able to demand reform and democracy for their own people in the West Bank and Gaza. Then there is the element of fear. I can understand many people who are living in Gaza and are afraid to speak out. And the same thing happens in Ramallah, in the West Bank. Not only are people afraid of being arrested or killed or harassed by these two governments, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, they're also afraid of losing their jobs. What happens is that if you criticize, for example, the Palestinian Authority, you will end up without a job. The Palestinian Authority is the largest employer in the West Bank, and people are worried. They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want their relatives to be deprived of jobs. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't see this, this intifada or uprising against bad government. People are, for all these reasons, fear of being attacked, fear of losing their jobs, fear of retribution, and things like that.
Let me get a little bit personal for a moment before we ask you about the upcoming Palestinian elections, the riots, and then we'll open this up. And I've got 100 questions here come in for you. We need much more time or a follow-up. But I know you have a wife and 3 kids. You can't be on the top 3 popularity list of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. I know there's been threats. What do you tell your wife and kids when they walk in the street? How does this factor into your own personal life, taking this incredible role that you've taken as an honest journalist in the Middle East?
I see nothing heroic about telling the truth. I don't understand. Since when are people awarded for telling the truth or for not lying? This is many people call me and say, "Oh, you are very courageous. We want to give you an award." I say, "No. Why do I deserve an award? What did I do?" But look, I live in Israel. Fortunately for me, I work in Ramallah. I go there, but at the end of the day, I come back to Israel, where I feel safe, where my children feel safe, where my wife can go out and work and feel safe also. Why? Because in Israel, no masked man will knock on my door at night and threaten to kill me, or no policeman will come to arrest me for criticizing the Palestinian Authority. That does not happen inside Israel. And I even find it sad and ironic that I, as an Arab Muslim, I feel safer living under Israel than I do under a Palestinian or a Muslim regime in this part of the world. I said before, it's not about being pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. And, it's about telling the truth, pro the facts and the truth. Going back to the issue of the international media and all that, just to tell you about the difficulties I face or the challenges. There were times when I was working with, newspapers like The Observer in London, BBC, and other outlets that are not known for their, let's say, support for Israel. And we used to report stories very critical of Israel. And I even worked for a Hebrew newspaper that was criticizing Israel. Okay, that's legitimate. We didn't criticize Israel out of hatred for Israel. We criticized the police when they did something bad. We criticized the government when it took a wrong decision or things like that. During the time that I was helping the international media and reporting about stories that reflected negatively on Israel, I received 9 international awards. 9. And I was a hero in Europe, on the university campuses, and wherever I went. The problem started after 1994, after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Then, when I started criticizing the Palestinian Authority and later Hamas, that was the end of it. That was the end of my honeymoon with the international media. First of all, I lost 95% of my work with the international media. Why? Because, I dared to challenge the narrative that says, it's a narrative that says, in this conflict, there are good, Israel is the Israelis are the bad guys, the Palestinians are the good people, and we don't want to hear anything. And this just tells you how things are. They haven't changed, by the way. People like me will not easily find work in the mainstream media, the Western mainstream media. Why? Because, I don't fit into that category of journalists who are known for their severe criticism of Israel and who are willing to give the Palestinians a pass on everything. And in that sense, I consider myself to be more pro-Palestinian than many of them. Why? Being pro-Palestinian does not mean that you spew hatred against Israel. That doesn't make you pro-Palestinian. Being pro-Palestinian for me is when you demand reform, democracy, good government for the Palestinians. Is when you criticize Palestinian leaders for arresting journalists, for arresting social media users, for stealing the money of their own people. That's what is real pro-Palestinian. But, spewing hatred against Israel does not make you pro-Palestinian. You are just an Israel hater.
I've always thought that peace may well come by the businessmen before it'll come from the politicians. And when I say that, what I'm seeing is, if you look in who's in the pharmacies in Israel, who's in the hospitals, who's in the universities, the professions, you see many, many Palestinians, you see the representation, you see success, you see an evolving middle class. That doesn't get reported very broad. You have to hunt to find those kind of statistics as a percentage of pharmacists in the leading pharmaceutical company or Palestinians. You don't report the good stories. Those success stories seem to be underreported, as well as all these horrible things we've been talking about. Is that true?
You know why? Because many of the, or some of the foreign journalists are afraid that if they report stories, such positive stories about Israel, they will be accused of working for the Jewish lobby, or they will be accused of being Zionist agents, or they will be accused of being anti-Palestinian or propagandists. That's how it is. And that's the last thing they want. But there are many good stories out here. There's no shortage of good stories. The question we always need to ask ourselves is, who wakes up in the morning and decides what the story is? Who sets the agenda?
Let me lastly turn, before we get to Q&A, and I've got a lot of them, the Palestinian elections. So what is behind the rivalry? We know last time, the last election led to a civil war. We have probably the leading component, Marwan Barghouti, is imprisoned for murders that took place during the Second Intifada. Can you comment on what's really going on in these elections? And I know that's a long topic, but in a brief way, what's going on in these elections, and how is that related to what the violence is in the streets yesterday and today?
So first of all, as we speak right now, there is a meeting in Ramallah for the Palestinian leadership to decide on the future of the elections, whether they're holding them or not. We're talking about 2 elections for now. The parliamentary election, which is scheduled for May 22, and the presidential election scheduled for July 31. And as we speak, President Abbas and the Fatah leadership in Ramallah are meeting to decide on these elections. I call it a meeting to find an excuse to delay or cancel the elections. And what's the best excuse? To put the blame on Israel. Now, over the issue of Jerusalem, of course. Now, the violence in Jerusalem, I don't call it spontaneous, by the way, because in the last few weeks, those who have been following the statements of Palestinian leaders would have seen that the Palestinian leadership was talking about turning Jerusalem into a battlefield, about initiating clashes with the Israeli authorities in Jerusalem on the pretext that Israel is not going to allow us to hold elections in Jerusalem. So, I mean, for those who are not familiar with what's happening, the Palestinian Authority says we want to hold elections for the parliament and the presidency, and we want residents of East Jerusalem, Arabs living in Jerusalem, who hold Israeli ID cards to vote or to participate in that election. And we want the election to take place inside Jerusalem, in areas under Israeli control. Now, Israel has not responded yet. Israel did not say yes and did not say no. And the Palestinian Authority is already blaming Israel for not allowing the election. But excuse me, if Israel didn't say yes and didn't say no, why are you blaming Israel? Everyone here knows, even the child on the street knows, that if it were up to Mahmoud Abbas, he would have not had called the election. He called the election only because of pressure from the Biden administration and from the European Union. But why hold elections, 16 years later? And what is it going to benefit him? So he was happy sitting there. The Europeans, the Biden administration came to him and say, go have elections, we want to see reform, we want to see democracy. And now he and even Hamas are using the issue of Jerusalem, the violence in Jerusalem, as an excuse to put all the blame on Israel. But why can't you, for example, vote online? There's been a proposal from the European Union to let the residents of East Jerusalem participate in the Palestinian election online. The Palestinian Authority said, no, we want the election inside Jerusalem. It's like, even no matter what you offer them, they will always find a way to put the blame on Israel. And the funny part is, and many journalists have not noticed this, is that in the last 3 elections for the Palestinian parliament and the Palestinian presidency, only a few thousand residents of East Jerusalem participated. The vast majority did not care. So it's not really an issue. The participation or non-participation of Arabs in Jerusalem in the Palestinian election will not impact the results of the election anyway, because the majority of these Arabs don't participate in the election. They don't care about the election. They want to be part of Israel. Many of them are even worried that if they vote in the Palestinian elections, they will lose their status as permanent residents of Israel. So these are, this is how it's playing out. But for now, the general assessment over here is that President Abbas and the Palestinian leadership are looking for an excuse to delay or cancel the election, and by putting all the blame on Israel.
And just before we leave the topic of elections, does the failure of Netanyahu or Bennett or anyone at the Knesset to form a party change this landscape in any way from the perspective of Fatah or Hamas, or is it just a non-event?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Look, Fatah, Hamas, PFLP, DFLP, they see no difference between Benjamin Netanyahu, Bennett, Shimon Peres, Ehud Olmert, Ariel Sharon. They do not see a difference. It doesn't really make much of a difference. And they say it. They say there's no difference between right and left in Israel. They see Israel as an enemy. And it doesn't really matter. People forget, but we had Yitzhak Rabin in power. We had Shimon Peres in power. We had Ehud Olmert. We had left-wing, we had right-wing governments in Israel. It didn't change anything. The Palestinians do not relate to Israel in accordance with the identity or the political affiliation of its leaders. They see Israel as an enemy.
Well, there's a topic of incitement we didn't talk about, and I put up one slide that shows a map of the Middle East that I'm told is what kids study when they go to school. And so noticeably missing here is Israel. And so the narrative for the young is, and there's much more horrific anti-Semitic kind of things that are there online that we see. I'm not going to post them because we all know what they look like. But this is part of the problem, is this kind of incitement and perpetuation of this desire, whether it's formally in a platform or removed from a platform, of C to C, meaning there is no state of Israel, there is no recognition. Let me, Khaled, I want to turn to, I've got loads of questions, so let me take the last few minutes and honor some of these people who are writing in. And I don't think I'll identify people by name, although maybe they want to be identified by name, but just to ask a couple of these questions. Somebody is asking, what are the visions for the end of conflict held by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas? Well, the real question is there a vision for an end? Is there a vision for the end of an end of conflict by the leaders of Hamas or the PA?
Well, we're talking about two different visions here, at least publicly. The Palestinian Authority in public is saying, we support the two-state solution. But they're also saying Israel must give us 100% of what Israel took in 1967, which means give me all of East Jerusalem, give me all of the West Bank, give me all of Gaza, and then we will talk about the right of return for the Palestinian refugees and other issues, but give me 100% and there will be a deal. Now, Hamas, on the other hand, they have their own vision. They haven't changed. I've been following Hamas from day one. I was actually sitting in Gaza at the press conference when Hamas was established in 1988. And I give them credit for being very honest, very consistent, and very clear about their strategy. And it's very simple. They say, listen, folks, this land, all of it, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, is Waqf land that belongs to the Muslim Trust. No non-Muslim is entitled to any part of it. We want to replace Israel with an Islamic state. And if there are some Jews who would like to live as a minority under our new Islamic state, they are welcome. Otherwise, all of you get out of here or we will kill you and destroy you. So these are the two visions that we have so far.
Another question. This question comes from a very distinguished Canadian, supporter of honest reporting, and it has a Canadian slant to it, so I'm not sure if you can answer or not, but I'm going to read the question. Canada is a large funder of UNRWA. How much of a blind eye are reporters turning to corruption in that specific organization? And how can we better educate Canadians about what really goes on there in UNRWA?
Look, first of all, I think that the issue of corruption in UNRWA was recently exposed by the media. If you remember the issue of the some financial corruption, moral corruption, there was a commission of investigation. I don't know what happened with that investigation, but there was talk about that kind of corruption among the top brass of UNRWA. If you're talking about other corruption, other forms of corruption, like the, what do they do with the money that they get? How do they distribute it and all that? I'm not very familiar with that topic. But the question about UNRWA is much more complicated. UNRWA has been there for nearly 70 years now, or over 70 years. And it has, on the one hand, provided all kinds of services to the Palestinians. We're talking about education, health, and medical services. Okay. But then the question we need to ask ourselves is, what has UNRWA done to help these people move on with their lives? You can't give money to people in order to stay where they are. You're not helping these people build a future for their children. You're not helping them relocate, start a new life. You're just giving them money, giving them food, giving them education, and telling them stay where you are. Now, if you're doing that, you are actually perpetuating the issue of the problem of the refugees. That's number one. And more seriously, you are doing something much more dangerous than that. You are creating new generations of refugees. What does that mean? UNRWA allows Palestinians to inherit the status of refugees from their parents, from their grandparents. So if the real number of Palestinian refugees was, let's say, 400, 500,000, now we go to UNRWA and you ask them how many Palestinian refugees are there, and they will give you a figure close to 6 million or 5.5 million. And it's like, what? So UNRWA is not only perpetuating the problem, it is making it bigger by creating these new generations. And I know people living in Canada, in Toronto and other places, who hold the card of issued by UNRWA stating that they are refugees. So how does UNRWA help in that sense? Maybe the Canadians and the other donors need to go to UNRWA and start searching for solutions. But you can't continue like this. It doesn't work like that. For Israel, by the way, it's a dilemma, and I'll tell you why. In many ways, if you think about it, UNRWA exempts Israel of its own responsibility towards these people. When Israel was in control of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel did not dismantle UNRWA or kick them out. Why? Because if you do that, then you will have to start funding the schools and providing the services that UNRWA does. So, if you want to get rid of UNRWA today in the West Bank, for example, you need to find an alternative. And the best alternative is the Palestinian Authority that is receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from the international community. It should be responsible for these refugee camps and not UNRWA. It should be responsible for providing these people with jobs and other services, and not UNRWA. Because my concern is that if we bring down UNRWA today, the Palestinian Authority is not going to step in, and then the world will come to Israel and say, okay, Israel, now you go. You hire these teachers, you hire these workers of UNRWA. So for Israel, it's a dilemma, as I said.
One last quick question I'll ask you, because it deals with the future, and one tries to be optimistic about the future. And really the question is, what hope for the next generation of Palestinian journalists do you have?
Well, if you're referring to my colleagues in the West Bank and Gaza, I'm sorry to tell you that, when I look at how they are operating right now, or many of them, I see that many of them see themselves as foot soldiers serving the revolution, as being part of the establishment, as being a spokesman for their government, for their people, for their homeland, which is okay. I mean, I'm not saying Palestinian journalists should not identify with the Palestinian people, but you need to draw the line between, your loyalty to your cause and your leaders and your loyalty to the profession. And I would like to see more journalists who are independent, who are, following the ethics of journalism. And I do have some colleagues here and there, but they're not in an easy situation. Again, if you're living under Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, you're taking a big risk. because these two governments do not tolerate any form of criticism. They do not understand journalism. We don't have a free media in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, and we don't have a free and independent media in Gaza. I can't even talk about a media in Gaza, by the way, under Hamas, because it's almost vanished over there.
Well, on that note, I'll remind people that next Monday, I think, is International Journalism Day. So hopefully we can take what you've just said, upload it and broadcast it to the world and improve the state of journalism. Khaled, I can't thank you enough. It's not uncommon for brave people not to see their own bravery. I don't think Nobel has a prize for honesty, but if they did, I'd be nominating you. Again, thank you to you for that incredible time. There's so much we did cover. There's a lot more we didn't cover, but I think it gave people some exposure to the depth and the breadth and the work that you're doing, for which we are very appreciative. Thank you, Khaled. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.